The importance of David Epstein's book Range, Why Generalists Triumph in a Specialist World, is topically general, in the sense that it's so broadly applicable, that is. Epstein discusses the importance of a generalist approach to all aspects of life, be they professional, athletic, or artistic pursuits. Further to this, though, he places value on the immeasurable benefits sought of being a generalist, in childhood learning, in political stance, in one's understanding of social situations. In every aspect of everyone's life, being a generalist has a benefit. To boil it down, however, Epstein suggests that in a world supporting hyperspecialization, the true benefit of being a generalist is overlooked. He gives examples of child prodigy athletes, chess players, and musicians being surpassed by latecomers to their respective contexts. He contends that these people who joined later benefited from a generalist perspective, gained from a more diverse early life experience. This is important to many in this class, as we are at a point where we're picking our majors, uni degrees, internships, career paths. We are already specializing and taking it so seriously, but Epstein says we're wrong in this. This specialization is not the be-all and end-all. We can just treat this as yet another chapter in our biographies. I've always been taught that the takeaway from our education should not be the explicit content, but the way of thinking. I believe that's what Range ultimately is trying to say. It's not to specialize, but rather don't shrink the scope of your thinking to that specialization. Keep your mind open. Embrace creativity, a broad imagination, think big and liberally, and that's where those genius, out-of-the-box solutions come from. There are three key ideas in Range that stand out to me. One in particular, as I certainly hold this mentality myself, is that having blinders on to keep you in your lane slows progress. Epstein gives a real-world example of a man named Dunbar, who spent time in labs where scientists were researching bacteria. He used the analogy of digging a trench without ever looking up to the surface to see where you were going. You could be heading in the wrong direction and you wouldn't know. So rather than just mindlessly tunneling, stay aware of your surroundings. In the lab example, two independent labs, both observed by Dunbar, were looking for a fix for E. coli proteins becoming stuck in test equipment. One lab had medical specialists, chemists, and physicists. The other had a highly trained E. coli specialists exclusively. The medical specialists knew all about E. coli, and the chemists knew about the pH environment that was causing the protein to get stuck. In a discussion between these two scientists, they were able to come up with a solution. In the other lab, in contrast, while they had an incredible understanding of the bacteria itself, they didn't know the chemistry on which the tests were based. Hence, Dunbar watched them test and fiddle for weeks to eventually find the same solution that had taken the other lab merely hours. Now, this is relevant to us, as when we're in high school and in part whilst we're in uni, working in solo is the norm. The workplace, however, is often different. And for effective and progressive collaboration, individual work where one person has the answer and keeps it to themselves is highly inefficient and obstructive. Had the lab have shared the solution, the time of the other scientists would have been better spent and not wasted on the problem with a known solution. Another core idea of Range is that of desirable difficulty in learning. Effective learning is often slow and inefficient in the short term, but provides deeper and more lasting knowledge. Techniques like mixing subjects, spacing out study sessions, improve long-term retention compared to cramming. The interesting detail, though, is how counterintuitive we are when it comes to our own understanding. When we feel like we are learning a lot, we are actually absorbing, retaining very little. And when we feel a struggle, that's when we learn the most. In other tests, it was found that students favoured teachers that long-term taught them the least. In the short term, they gained the most immediate results, but they learned in such a way that within only a few months, they would lose close to all they had learned. The third point I'd like to highlight is what Epstein dubs the trouble with too much grit. While perseverance is valued, quitters statistically have the best fulfilling careers. Strategic quitting, as he says, leaving a path that doesn't fit, is a crucial skill for finding a better match. And that induces a bit of confidence in me. It's never too late. If a job, a degree, a relationship, it's not for you, it's truly acceptable to leave. In fact, you might be better off. I struggle to find core issues with most of what Epstein posits in his Range. His points are well researched, founded in fact, and are mostly objective, which are naturally hard to refute. The first of my two concerns, however, is significant, and it's that whilst being generalist when in a managerial position is all well and good, To get there in the real world, to get a job from which to develop as a strategic leader, takes an entry-level role. It takes having majored in accounting or strategy or finance, law, sometimes even more specific than those, to get that job in the first place, a point from which to start off with. It demands specialisation. I raise this as it's a concern of mine lately, as I choose my majors for uni. My goal long term is to be a manager, hopefully an executive strategy role. So my studies are preparing me to do this: business law, strategy electives, business management. But in terms of getting a job to set off on my career path, I think I'll struggle. You don't get hired into a management role straight out of uni. You have to prove yourself. And without an initial specialisation, you have nothing to prove yourself with. Second, Epstein spends a lot of time discussing elite performers and athletes, and their specialisation or generalisation in their respective fields. In sport, for example, Epstein lists the benefits of not specialising early, but I think he failed to highlight the importance of training skills that ultimately prove transferable. He gave the example of Rafael Nadal and Roger Federer. They both started tennis very young, at the age of 3, but Federer specialised almost immediately. Nadal continued to play soccer and other sports into his teens. But in the background, doing these sports, he was still training skills that proved transferable to tennis. My point is that a degree of specialisation is important to set the direction you're working towards. In the context of tennis, continue to play sports. Nadal shouldn't have gone off and become a lawyer hoping it would help his tennis. He was always, consciously or not, working towards his sport. The other example was in music, the famous jazz musician behind Take 5. The composer was a saxophonist, Paul Desmond, but his musical debut wasn't on a saxophone, it was as a classical pianist, then guitar, only later becoming a saxophonist. Breadth builds skill, in this case timing, musical intuition, and ear for notes, I'm sure. But diverse early training may provide creative advantages, and Epstein's 100% correct in this. But should the instrument-specific skill not be developed, Paul Desmond never would have been found. My advice based on this book is this. An increased prevalence of AI is further reducing the amount of grunt work in the workplace. And so there is an increase in work that requires thinking. Real, unique, and out-of-the-box thinking. This book is a guide on how to do that better. A breadth of knowledge and understanding of multiple perspectives creates a generalized view and makes for a much better and much more creative thinker. Next piece of advice would be to look out of yours and into other people's trenches. Look not in a devious way as to cheat or steal their work, but to gain insight, perspective on how people approach problems. If you're smart, you might get a boost to the next level. If you're lucky, you might just be exposed to something that gives you a brainwave to have that next breakthrough idea. And the last one, if it counts as a piece of advice at all, I don't know. But a thought-provoking fact it is. A story riddled with moral precedents that should stay with you. And it comes in the form of a shortened quote from Epstein's book. Suppose you're a doctor operating on a patient with a malignant tumour. It is impossible to operate on this patient, but unless this tumour is destroyed, they will certainly die. There is a kind of ray that can destroy the tumour. If the ray can reach the tumour at a significantly high intensity, they will kill the cancer cells. Unfortunately, at this intensity, the healthy cells that the rays pass through on the way to the tumour will also be destroyed. At lower intensities, the ray will not kill the healthy cells, but nor will it prove effective on the tumour cells. What kind of treatment could be used? Let me give you a story to help you think. There was a Mongolian warrior who was trying to storm a fortress. There were multiple small roads leading to this structure, but none could support the entirety of his army. There were some large artery roads that led to the fortress, but they were defended, and should the warrior send his army down that path, they would surely be defeated. He pondered over this problem for days. He had the idea to divide his army into multiple smaller groups, send each of these down those different small roads leading to the fortress. With synchronized watches, they would storm at exactly the same time, with the entire might of his army on one central location. He did successfully storm the fortress. Now, to answer the original tumour question, if you haven't already solved it, we can fire multiple weaker lasers culminating in one point that can be powerful enough to kill the tumour cells. In the same way the Mongolian troops divided, then convened in a central fortress, the laser too can be divided and then convened at the point of the tumour. Given this problem, only 10% could find the solution. The problem and the Mongolian story, 30% could answer. With both the story and some time, still only 60% could answer. Our brains struggle to draw links between unidentical problems, but that's because we weren't trained how to. We can learn.